You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your doomsayer host, Abraham.
And I am definitely not your survivalist host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do and what people might do hypothetically in an event that is almost certainly never going to take place. At least we hope not. Anyway, we talk about psychology things. That's what we do.
That's mostly what we do, yeah. And this is one of those weird ones where we can only hypothesize what would happen because in the event of a true apocalypse, we could not retroactively study it because we wouldn't be around to study it.
You said the word. We're talking about the apocalypse.
Ooh. But not like the fun, cool metal ones like in the Bible, like where it's like very metal and there's dragons. Like we're talking about things that happen in the real world where, you know, it's a little bit scary. And maybe we've seen some examples in movies.
As you said, it is hypothesizing, it is speculating a bit, but we're going to largely couch this on precedent. We're going to use the events that have happened in the past to talk about what might happen in the future if we were to be faced with some extinction level catastrophic event.
Hopefully that does not happen in our lifetimes.
Yes, and or maybe ever, you know, it'd be great.
Or ever, really, truly.
Yeah. I mean, eventually the sun will swallow the earth, but hopefully humans will have been gone for a long time at that point. So
that's the goal, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, before the sun swallows the earth, before humans wipe each other out or evolve into something else or just abandon our planet and go live on some other planets, we can acknowledge that at least on the day that this releases, we can wish everybody happy Atheist Pride Day.
I never realized there was a holiday that I could feel so seen, but here we are.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. As a white man, I finally get a holiday. It's also Bed In for Peace Day. So that's kind of fun. I like that.
Bibliomania Day. There's a lot of book-centric holidays, I think. That's great.
I like that. It's Extraterrestrial Abductions Day. So I guess if you want to get away from an apocalypse, that's a good way to do it.
That's pretty good. Now, confusingly with Atheist Pride Day, it is also International Astrology Day.
Yep. Mercury is in marmalade. It's also International Day of Happiness.
Kick Butts Day. I think maybe kick your own butt. And maybe even more metaphorically than anything, like kick your butt doing a really hard workout or something. Or like maybe you debate really well and kick someone's butt metaphorically by winning the debate.
Yeah, don't touch anybody without their consent is really what we're trying to get at there.
Yeah.
Don't assault anybody. It's also National Jump Out Day.
Sure. Don't know what that means, but it is National Native American HIV/AIDS Awareness Day.
Very specific and very important. It's National Ravioli Day, which I particularly enjoy.
It is Won't You Be My Neighbor Day.
Oh, Mr. Rogers. I saw something that said he was part of like the Holy Trinity with Bob Ross and I forget who the other person. Crocodile Hunter. Like the three of them were like, it was like be kind to nature, be kind to others, and be kind to yourself. And that was like the real Holy Trinity. And I was like, I love that. That's perfect.
That's really fun.
It's so great. It's also World Frog Day. So if you like that sort of thing.
Yeah, frogs are great. Presumably, I think that means be nice to frogs.
Yeah.
In addition to the fact that it is the International Day of Happiness, it's also Act Happy Week. So for one day, be happy. For the rest of the week, act happy.
Yeah. They don't mince words there. It's also American Chocolate Week, which, for our international listeners, you're probably thinking, ugh, but I like chocolate, so I'm fine with it.
Yeah, and I would say Hawaiian chocolate specifically, and I've said this many times on the show, so I'm sorry you all keep hearing it, but Hawaiian chocolate, you almost can't do better. I'm sorry everybody around the world, but try the Hawaiian chocolate. And I love the like dark bitter chocolates that are common in other places around the world. That's that's right up my alley. But Hawaiian chocolate.
We just lost all of our Belgian listeners.
That's right, yeah. Yes, Belgian chocolate, very good. Hawaiian chocolate, very, very, very good. Just saying.
On a scale of very, very, it's very, very, very good.
That's right. It is Clutter Awareness Week. Get the clutter out.
Yeah, I'm very well aware of mine. So
right.
It's International Goof Off Week, which I feel like is just what I do every day. So
sure,
glad that it's recognized.
International Teach Music Week. Love that. That's great. Any more? Is that just playing synthesized tones and loops?
I hope not. I hope everybody gets a trombone or a violin if you like that stuff too. it's also Ramadan. So,
Hey,
yay, that's nice.
happy Ramadan. Our thoughts are with you, those people for whom this is a very tough time because of the state of the world at the time that we're releasing this. It is World Folk Tales and Fables Week.
Yes, which I love. I love a good story. So
yes. Well, and that actually plays beautifully into our topic for today because we're going to be telling some good stories. It is
we certainly are.
End of the world story day.
Hey, yes, that's what we're celebrating.
Yeah.
So we are going to talk about the apocalypse, but really we're going to focus on talking about how people respond in the face of an apocalypse, because I think there are a lot of depictions and there are a lot of kind of guesses and questions, but we're really going to spend some time unpacking what it is that people will do in the event that things go terribly, terribly wrong.
And I mean, the doomsday preppers, conspiracy theorists, extremely religious extremists, and Hollywood have all sort of speculated on what the doomsday would look like. And there's so many movies and TV shows about this. There's Day After Tomorrow, Moonfall, Walking Dead, Mad Max, Zombieland, Last of Us TV show, and then the game, I guess. Bird Box, The Road, Waterworld, Into the Forest, Children of Men, Book of Eli, 28 Days Later, and 12 Monkeys are just some examples of Hollywood telling stories about what the end of the world will be like and how people will be in the event of the apocalypse.
Right. And so you'll find that a lot of these kind of end of days scenarios, their predictions kind of talk about how humans will behave. And in all of these scenarios, humans descend into roving gangs of murderers and looters and a few good guys just trying to get by, but it's mostly just total chaos, total pandemonium. And any stranger meeting another person immediately pulls a gun and threatens violence. And that's kind of the image, right? So when things go wrong and all of the structures of humanity break down, we are left to danger, to aggression, to just constant survival mode. And we don't really know that that's the most accurate way to describe what would happen.
We fortunately have not actually had to experience like the biblical ending of the world, everything on fire and gods and demons coming down and killing us all, at least not exactly in that way. And so we've sort of just speculated what would happen. And I think for the sake of drama, it makes a lot of sense in a storytelling capacity where your only goal is entertainment, is to have antagonists, is to have conflict.
Right.
And so you manufacture the conflict for the sake of the story. Are these musings a good depiction of how people would behave? And what would people actually do in the event of the apocalypse? And that could be zombie apocalypse. It could be a major meteor crashing into Earth and breaking down civilization, nuclear war, whatever it might be. What would we expect people to do in one of these situations that they've just depicted in movies and TV shows?
We're going to look at some of the most destructive crises in history that humans have experienced and kind of talk about some logical deduction using our understanding of psychology and how humans will respond in these types of scenarios. Just knowing kind of what we know about pro-social behavior, about systems, about all of those things, we're going to kind of apply those models to these end of the world scenarios.
Yeah, it's a two-pronged approach of looking at history, just what has already happened. What can our experiences as a species tell us about what we might do in an event like this? And then also we can take this from the angle of what makes logical sense with our understanding of a very basic application of like logic to the circumstances of the scenario, as well as our understanding of human behavior and psychology.
Right. Absolutely.
So it's worth starting with what an apocalypse is. And there are kind of two different definitions here, because I think the term apocalypse was more or less introduced and understood by the Bible. And this is a book of Revelations, and it is the complete and final destruction of the world, or at least the people on the world. It is the end of days, at least for humans.
Not the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie where he's a drunk detective that fights the devil.
Yes, not that one.
Very different end of days. But really what we're talking about with an apocalypse and kind of what it's come to be known as is a catastrophically devastating destructive event. So there are a lot of different ways this could come up. I mean, if you follow anything from NASA, then you know that there are always asteroids that fly by the Earth far too close for comfort. It could be nuclear war. It could be an oncoming ice age. It could be any of these things. But these destructive events essentially the idea is that it wipes out structures of humanity or the majority of people in a lot of different ways, or all of the people, and kind of leaves folks to survive in these kind of after event atmospheres or environments.
Yeah, and they could also include things a little bit more, I guess you could say, pedestrian, like disease. We just recently made our way through a global pandemic. Mm-hmm. It could be something like the catastrophes that have been developing as an outcome of global climate change, which we don't even know what those all are going to be, but we've already started to see what some of them will be, and they are very unpleasant. And that could lead to, sea level rise. And then, of course, the threat of global self-annihilation in the form of mass, global war against one another using highly, highly destructive weapons that are very capable of ending human life, the whole species as it were. So anyway, with all those considerations, we can look back and say, what have people done in the times of severe crises? And as I said, we haven't gone through the biblical apocalypse, but we've gone apparently through some things that were kind of close to that, and how the magnitude of them and the severity of those events.
Right. And as we kind of start to gather more information about the history of humans, and we start to look at the events that are coming up and all of the possibilities and all of the models, there are some, I think it's really fascinating, and we'll probably get into this. There are some signs that the apocalypse is on its way, or there are some signs that things are going to get worse for humans. And one of those signs is ads.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we've doomed us all with the ads.
No.
We did make it through the ad break, though. So let's talk about the time that all the proto-humans died, except for very few.
Yeah. So human ancestors date back over 1 million years ago. I mean, if you subscribe to like evolution and like history and all that stuff, if you're reading like an old book written by people, then not so much. But yeah, what we subscribe to is this idea that humans have been around for a while. As humans evolved into different species, eventually Homo sapiens only emerged around 300,000 years ago. One source suggested that Homo sapiens from 300,000 years ago were archaic Homo sapiens, and that modern Homo sapiens emerged only about 160,000 years ago. That's still like too much time for me to comprehend.
That's a long time. Like, it is really difficult to try and wrap our minds around even 160,000 years, let alone 140,000 on top of that to make 300,000 years. And yeah, like, our lives are so short that we tend to look back in history and it's hard to make sense of it. And so we may subscribe to a nonsensical view that contradicts all available evidence that like humans have only been around for 5,000 years or 6,000.
Well, I mean, the 90s were only a couple years ago. So like, I think that all of us have like a weird distortion of time in general, you know?
Yeah. So time is hard. Big numbers are hard, and it's okay to not be able to wrap your head around that and have it still be accurate.
Right.
That's where we're at. But anyway, this is Homo sapiens we're talking about that have only been around for, let's say, 300,000 years. There was this weird enigmatic gap in the human fossil record of ancestors of current Homo sapiens around 900,000 years ago. Just all of a sudden, there were far fewer human fossils for a significant chunk of time. And in addition to fossils, researchers developed new techniques for sequencing DNA that illustrated the lineage of genetic evolution of ancestors of humans into what would become, Homo sapiens. And according to essentially what they did in compiling the available evidence in this 2023 article in Science, the journal Science, by Hu and colleagues, a human ancestor of Homo sapiens may have come to the brink of extinction. So we'll describe sort of what happened in this event, but essentially they said there was this severe population bottleneck where the number of humans on Earth plummeted to very, very few, relatively speaking. And it is worth pointing out that the study was criticized by some other scientists for the strength of their conclusions, but many scientists have accepted this as a reasonably plausible interpretation of the data so far. So there's at least good reason to believe that they're probably right, at least about parts, if not all of their discussion in this article about this bottleneck. But just to say that we understand there is a little bit of controversy, I think it's worth simply accepting that what they said is most likely pretty much accurate or pretty close to it.
Right. Just to kind of illustrate, though, I think maybe why people are also a little bit nervous about accepting this as a thing that happened is this shift, this bottleneck in the population saw 98.7% of humans on the planet wiped out, either due to extreme cold or severe drought.
Or both.
Or both, right. It's a significant drop in human population to the degree that most species would probably not come back from such a low number, or from such a catastrophic population decimation.
Yeah, essentially the data suggests, their model suggests that the humans dwindled down to only 1,280 people left on the entire planet. Aliens visiting Earth at this point would have found these
wild.
Yeah, they would have found these human ancestors, because they really weren't Homo sapiens yet, but they would have found these human ancestors, and there would have only been a little over 1,000 of them on all of Earth. That was it. And that this population stayed that way, stayed at that size for about 117,000 years.
I think that in itself sounds unbelievable, but if there's significant evidence, or at least gaps in evidence to suggest otherwise, it's completely plausible to think about that. So
yeah, and to be clear, it was not the same group of people that lived for 117,000 years. It was just that the population level. So they were obviously having kids, and there's subsequent generations. People don't live for 100,000 years.
Yeah, we're not talking about Adam and Eve here. I'm sorry. I know I'm taking a lot of jabs at the Bible. It's just easy. It's easy. It's low hanging fruit here. It's not the same people. But especially because I would imagine that life expectancy was probably fairly low at that time. So you're talking hundreds of generations inside of that.
Yeah.
So had these remarkable individuals not proven to be so resilient, we would not be here today. And that's, I think, a really important thing to consider, considering that our population has now bloomed to what it is and maybe a little bit overpopulated. It's pretty incredible to think that only about 1,200 people are responsible for us being here today.
Yeah. I mean, this wasn't the fire and brimstone destruction of the world as described in the Bible, but I mean, it was the near extinction of humans. You know, the humans that would eventually become Neanderthals, Denisovans, and eventually Homo sapiens, those were almost gone, down to this tiny handful of people that are the reason that we're here today, assuming that the evidence that we have is all accurate and how we've interpreted it. And again, it seems like for the most part, we think that is pretty close to accurate, if not dead on. Right.
So let's shift gears a little bit. We're going to do a time jump, as we talked about in our Patreon specific stuff about Dune. We're going to do a little bit of a time jump, as Frank Herbert would do, and talk about Mount Toba. Now, about 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano called Mount Toba in what is now Indonesia exploded in a catastrophic event that nearly wiped out the humans again. Because what you're going to discover as we go through this is that humans are fragile, squishy creatures.
We're
not like tardigrades that can survive in these situations. We hurt and we squish and we're just sacks of meat that are just trying to survive at our computers every day. So this mountain explodes and nearly wipes us all out.
Exactly. You know, it's one thing to have extreme cold and drought that would wipe out food and nearly kill everyone on Earth. And that's certainly something that could happen. And you could see why something that affects the whole planet in that way would be a sort of extinction level event. But just a volcano exploding seems like it wouldn't be. Well, this was no ordinary explosion here. This eruption sent shockwaves across the entire planet. The explosion alone, just the initial explosion, blanketed Indonesia, what's now Indonesia, and India in 6 inches of debris. So we're talking like a massive geographical area far from the actual volcano itself, covered by tons of debris and ash.
Right. And the ash from the eruptions filled the atmosphere so completely that the average global temperature dropped by 3 to 5 degrees. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but when the overall global temperature drops, that's bad.
Yeah, that's a significant shift.
Yeah, that's not like your day. It's not like 70 degrees and it drops to 67 degrees and you're like, oh no, we're talking global shift in temperature, which is a global shift in climate, which is a global shift in all the things that sustain ecosystems. So this change massively disrupted many ecosystems and killed many animals and plants alike, leading to mass starvation. So this one event caused catastrophic damage globally simply by disrupting those ecosystems.
The eruption was so severe and widespread in its effect, some researchers interpreted the evidence and calculated that 10,000 people, or even as few as only 3,000 humans, survived this event due to the severe alteration in climate and food resources, the mass starvation, the cold, and the inhospitable environment of an ashen landscape that destroyed the possibility of life for a huge chunk of the world. It really brought human population again down to just a few thousand individuals. Somehow we soldiered on.
So here's the thing that I've kind of learned about the planet. The planet wants us dead. Like, I don't know that everybody realizes that. But when you think about it, like that's why we have to build things to protect ourselves from the planet, because the planet itself does not want us around. Like, let me be clear. It just doesn't care that we're around. Like, the planet's going to do whatever it does. It's not actively trying to kill us. It's going to do whatever it does. It does not care whether we are here or not. It probably does now. It's probably going like, oh God, like this is like we're like a woolly sweater that they're trying to shake off, you know?
Well, and it does seem like, and thinking through this, because at least these first couple of events were not even Homo sapiens yet. Well, we were Homo sapiens for the Mount Toba explosion, but prior to that, the huge bottleneck that happened, and any that we don't have other records of that may have occurred, these major extinction level events, like these, you could also look at these as evolutionary selection pressures that pushed the evolution of humans towards some of the traits that we ended up developing.
Right.
That the ones who didn't have the traits that we have now are the ones that died off. And so what was left, what was selected for by these events.
Oh, I love evolution. So, but let's talk for a second about temperatures and freezing with our next section called So Cold. If you're not familiar, we both like Further Seems Forever. So that's that reference.
Yes. So the first time the event we were talking about, people were too cold. There's freezing temperatures and drought. Then it was too hot. Volcanic eruption, although technically part of what was really the killer was a lot of cold after that. Anyway, so we had the cold, we had the volcano, and then the Earth was plunged into a 10,000 year colossal ice age starting about 20,000 years ago.
Right. So the average global temperatures dropped as much as 10 degrees, which again, does not sound like a lot on a day-to-day basis, but when the entire globe changes, it shifts ecosystems, it shifts populations, it shifts all these things. And so this change resulted in massive glaciers stretching across much of the land in the Northern Hemisphere, North America and Eurasia. So you see just kind of widespread ice and cold and chilliness and not a sweater to be seen.
Yeah, and I mean, if you imagine these massive, massive glaciers, like things aren't growing in these. They have essentially wiped out places where land was, where things could grow, and was just at a freezing temperature all the time. So the world became almost impossibly inhospitable to many animals, including humans.
Right.
And this is also this is when mastodons and saber-toothed cats died out because of the severity of the environment.
Right. And so despite these temperatures driving well-coated, hardy creatures such as these to extinction, somehow the soft, defenseless, mostly furless humans managed to adapt and survive. So again, maybe it's God's will.
Something. So people have been soldiering on through these huge environmental disasters that are largely about things freezing and food being disrupted and all of that sort of thing. And I guess massive amounts of lava and hot ash as well.
Ugh.
But as humans continued to soldier on, we eventually started coalescing into these massive groups of people. And in doing so, we were able to construct large buildings for shelter. And also these buildings that, because they protected us from the elements, would enable a variety of human activities that may have otherwise been prohibited during certain seasons. So essentially, we could be productive all year round in all kinds of weather. And we could do so in a way that allowed us to kind of build and expand all the things that we were doing much more rapidly. And there was just a ton of people all grouped together. But it's that ton of people all grouped together thing that actually started to become a problem.
Right. So as human groups became larger and larger, some new diseases started to breed in the gross conditions created by large groups with poor infrastructure because, for some reason, nobody thought they should anywhere but in the streets. So that was happening a lot. And because people were pooping in the streets, that didn't make for conditions to stay healthy.
And they're dumping like human and other like construction waste into their drinking water supplies and then being like, that's fine.
Yeah. But today we're worried about fluoride.
Right. And so people were, I think understandably, mostly only drinking alcohol because it could be distilled from plants that we're getting groundwater and not like fresh water because there was very little fresh water because we were polluting the crap out of it. Anyway, in these conditions, a little bacteria called Yersinia pestis was started hitching a ride on some fleas. Fleas that were largely living on rats, but they were also living on other animals and definitely living around humans. And this little bacteria was one of the most easily communicable and also deadliest bacteria that we had ever encountered as a species.
Yes. So symptoms of this bacteria when you caught this thing included diarrhea, blister. It's all the things that you hear about in Pepto-Bismol commercials, but worse. Diarrhea, blisters, like a general malaise, chills, delirium, bloody coughs, and black bulges or buboes in the thighs and armpits. And those sores gave rise to the common name for this disease, the bubonic plague. Ooh.
So the first time this happened in 541 CE, the bubonic plague swept across the world, killing more than 50 million people and, quote, came close to wiping out the whole of mankind, end quote, from Procopius in The Secret History, as the author and the name of the writing.
Well, it's funny that he wrote a book called The Secret History, and it's a public book. So, how secret is it?
That's
you know
right.
what I'm saying? Evocative title, I guess. So in 1347, the plague returns and wipes out another 200 million people in Eurasia and Africa. So real bad. This thing is pretty gnarly. I mean, we did an episode on it. It's gnarly.
Yeah, it was rough. And so as these filthy colonizers continued to grow and spread their numbers in a variety of unsanitary conditions, essentially they actually started developing immunities to all of these diseases and plagues that they were cultivating in their everyday environments. And so even though they started to adapt to and live, I guess you could say, symbiotic lives with these diseases that they were creating out of their horrific conditions that they were also creating, they also were starting to explore and colonize the world. And they brought these diseases with them as they were tramping around the world in a mad genocidal rampage to steal land from indigenous people and in other parts of the world.
Oh, man, people are going to be so mad that we told the truth. Yeah, humans are gross. I mean, that's something too. Like, humans are soft and squishy, but humans are gross. And we make diseases that are gross and we give them to people unfairly.
Yeah.
So these colonizers had more advanced weapons, but more than that, they brought things like smallpox, measles, typhoid, and cholera to these different civilizations that did not have these things. And these diseases alone destroyed 95% of these indigenous peoples over 150 years. The totality of their death was so massive that researchers believe the decreased CO2 being put into the atmosphere by the people being killed off actually decreased the global temperature slightly, resulting in a, quote, little ice age. So the mass destruction that disease brought because of colonizers may have actually caused a global event simply because of the lack of CO2 that was being produced by people.
Yeah, like that. That's how many people died because of it. So again, wiped out a huge chunk of the population. All right. So just as a quick recap here, we have things that have almost killed humans. We had this ice age with a drought. We had this massive volcano that also drops temperatures. We had another really massive ice age. Then we had the spread of significant diseases. Then we had ads. We survived another ad break, only to talk about the next thing that almost killed humans, another volcano.
Of course it was a volcano. So as this little ice age was starting to thaw out, a volcano gave it a violent push into a warming direction. And this happened in 1815.
Yes. So in 1815, Mount Tambora on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa, I hope I'm saying that close to right, this blasted enough debris into the atmosphere to thrust the world back into a volcanic winter. The explosion itself instantly killed 10,000 islanders, and the smoke and ash filled the atmosphere of the entire planet, dropping the global temperature by 5 degrees.
Right. And so the cold and ash and smoke resulted in freezing and flooding and blocked out the sun around the world for so long it was called the year without a summer. Incidentally, this is when and why Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, because they were stuck inside due to the terrible weather, and she and her husband and their friends challenged each other to a writing competition, which is one of my favorite little bits of trivia, and also why Chuck Palahniuk's book Haunted is written the way it is. It's written based on this experience from Mary Shelley.
Oh, I didn't know that. I don't think I've read that, but now I want to check that out.
Yeah, the premise of Haunted is a bunch of authors get together and try to recreate the experience that Mary Shelley and all those folks had in writing horror stories. And then the short stories that are in it are all based on what the authors came up with during that time.
Oh. So in 1815, Mount Tambora erupted. In 1816 is when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. I mean, that was called The Year Without a Summer. And it was because Mount Tambora had blanketed the earth in ash, and the damage that this caused to food and supplies and crops around the world killed an estimated additional 100 to 200,000 people.
I mean, again, it's just we're fragile creatures.
So those are those 5 or 6 major events that have nearly wiped out humans, or at least caused substantial critical levels of destruction to a large number of people. So, I mean, that's just looking at history. What has happened throughout history, and every single time one of these events happened, people pulled through. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. But so those are one type of event. But what about in the event that we get way too overcrowded?
Yes, and this brings us to this really interesting experiment that is called Ratopia. So
we're calling it that. He called it Rat Utopia.
Yeah, we're calling it that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ratopia is way more fun though.
Yeah.
We're big fans of portmanteaus here.
Yeah.
In 1947, John B. Calhoun, which, is it's just such an American name, conducted an experiment in which it's like, if I put into Chat GPT and said, give me the most American name ever, it would be like, if it wasn't like Eagle McFreedom, it would be John B. Calhoun. So in 1947, he conducted an experiment in which he gave rats a finite amount of space, but all the resources they could ever need. So basically, super enriched environment, no want for anything, as much food, water, everything they needed inside that space.
He seeded these little environments with a few pregnant mother rats, and then he just let them breed indefinitely to see what would happen when the enclosure became overpopulated. And again, food and water were always abundant. They had access to all the resources they could possibly need, but they were allowed to more or less just breed freely and just to see what would happen once their space was pretty much filled with rats. Thus, the rats rapidly populated and filled the entire space that they were in because resources were freely available and they really had no predators in that environment.
Right. So the rats were fine with each other. They were totally good until space started to become scarce and then was completely overcrowded in that space. And then that's when everything started to break down. Rats started killing each other. They started cannibalizing their dead. They started killing the babies. A lot of bad things happened, and some withdrew and hid, but ceased other necessary self-care behaviors. So they kind of stepped away, they walked away, but they stopped doing all the things they needed to do to survive.
You started seeing these variations in their overall behaviors, so particularly around sexual behaviors. So some started becoming exclusively homosexual, some became pansexual, some became hypersexual. They would just mount everything. And some became asexual. They wouldn't try and breed even if there was a eligible breeding partner there.
Right.
And eventually, with these mass die-offs, because of all the killing, all of the neglect, all of the lack of self-care, and basic survival behaviors and all of that, there were these mass die-offs of these rats in these enclosures, and what would be left was a small non-breeding population that would eventually die out, and then the entire group would be extinct.
Wild. They actually tried several variations of this with similar results. So you kind of saw the same thing happen over and over and over again. And this was eventually published in Scientific American in 1962.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a little bit different of a scenario. In the previous examples, we were talking about people dying off in large numbers. And in these experiments, they were looking at what would happen with rats if they became overpopulated and overcrowded. What does overpopulation look like?
Right.
Based on just these bits of data that we have, What did we learn?
We learned so many things. So we have to ask the question, how did people survive so many of these massive catastrophic events? And how did our ancestors beat the long odds and pull through events that killed off far more prepared creatures than us? That is ultimately the question that we are trying to solve here today.
So an archaeologist at the London Museum, Nick Ashton, was really impressed with that study that was talking about the bottleneck of humans 900,000 years ago. And he said, quote, "This would imply that it occupied a very localized area with good social cohesion for it to survive. Of greater surprise is the estimated length of time that the small group survived," end quote. And so he was commenting on the fact that, like, how would these people have made it through? Well, they worked together to pull through. There was good social cohesion. They were supported one another. That's the only thing that would make sense for how that group would have made it through that event.
Right. And there's another quote from one of the co-authors that says, quote, "We believe that our ancestors must have been well united to fight against the harsh environment." And that was a direct quote from Yi-Hsuan Pan.
Yeah, one of the authors on that study, which was a multi-country study. They had scientists from countries all over the world. There was 8 of them, I think.
That's cool.
Yeah. So when faced with catastrophic events, what we have seen is that people work together. They work together to find food, to defend their group, to build shelter, to protect their young. They work together. That is what people have done in all the times that we've ever been faced with these extinction level events that could have and probably should have, if we weren't really lucky, wiped out our species. But it just so happened that we had some very resilient people who were there. And the reason they were resilient is because they were so adept at working together to survive their circumstances.
Right. So history has shown us time and time again that when humans are faced with our extinction, we band together, we pool our resources, we think, we experiment, and work our way to a survival strategy. And if you don't really believe that, we've got anecdotal support just from the global pandemic and watching us go through that. I mean, if that isn't an example of everybody coming together and going, we should do this, I mean, except for people in Florida, we don't like masks here, apparently. I mean, everybody else was doing a really good job, I think, for the most part, trying to get through that.
Yeah, and they did, people pointed to how many people behaved during the pandemic as an example of why people would be so adversarial during a apocalyptic event, because they were so selfish. Certain groups of people were so selfish and adversarial. They were combative toward one another.
Right.
But honestly, as humans throughout human history, our most defining characteristic, and I say this not lightly, our most defining characteristic is our social organization and our capacity for cooperation. The evidence is overwhelming that this is the case.
It is probably the thing that has kept us alive. I mean, and this is the evidence that we're showing. It's it's probably the one thing. It's not our intelligence. It's not our unique individual acumen. It's the fact that we can band together, we can pool resources, and we can work together to find a survival strategy together as a species. We operate as one community. And here's the thing. Every day, millions of people climb into their little metal machines and go barreling down the paved paths with hundreds of other people doing the same thing. We moderate our speed against one another, communicate via signals, adhere to symbols and painted lines, and the vast majority of the time, we do so successfully with no one getting hurt. That in itself, driving down a highway, it should be, that is in itself an accomplishment. I mean, the road that I live on is connected to the most dangerous highway in the United States. And it's the most dangerous because by square mile, there are more decapitations on that highway than any other highway in the U.S. Because it's Florida. But I bring that up because I've driven down that highway hundreds of times at this point in time and been safe. And you watch people, for the most part, people are safe. That is a feat to be able to do that. And it's only a feat because other people are doing the same thing and communicating and working together to make it safe.
Yeah, I mean, people complain all the time about how bad other drivers are on the road. And while I'm not going to say that you're wrong, certainly I think most people could improve in their overall driving skills a lot of the time, I think it's also worth pointing out that most of the time people get from point A to point B successfully.
Right.
The fact that we have far fewer accidents than we do successfully completed trips. And obviously I think it would have to be that way for people to trust that as a reliable form of transportation. The fact that we can do that where we all have the choice as we're driving to drive however we want. And we have put systems in place to try and ensure that people will be be as safe as possible when driving, but nevertheless we do. And then when we get to where we're going, we walk into these buildings made by hundreds of people working together to mine, chop, or otherwise manufacture materials and meticulously engineer them together into building these safe structures. And in those structures, we fill them with precious resources, and we walk in, we calmly choose goods, exchange our stuff for their stuff, and then we leave without incident.
Right.
We only take what is allotted to us based on the systems that we've put into place. And granted, this is an exchange of money, but people don't just run in large groups and loot the store. They follow the systems and rules that we have because there is a social cohesion that helps us sort of navigate with respect to expectations of a societal structure.
Right. And people see strangers in need of food, in need of money, in need of help, in need of emergency services, and they jump in to help them without being coerced or forced to do so. I mean, I think the thesis of all of this is really to say that humans just help each other. And I think that's such a great thing for people who really struggle with the idea of humans being terrible or humanity is doomed, or maybe you have kind of a cynical view on the world. But I mean, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of years of history where humans have banded together to survive, to work together. And yes, there are a lot of dark corners of humanity, but for the most part, human beings do good for one another. They try to help each other, and humans themselves have survived. And one of the evolutionary benefits that we have had is that we have this kind of pro-social, this helping behavior, this cooperative behavior that has kept us around. If it wasn't for that, those volcanoes, that ice age, the bubonic plague would have wiped us out many, many centuries ago.
Exactly right. Although you wouldn't think so because of the ads. Despite the ads, we made it through. We're on the other side again. And I think there'll be the last ad break for this discussion anyway.
Yeah.
Just thinking about this, because we've been talking about the fact that humans are cooperative. They help each other. And you said that so beautifully in talking through, the evidence just shows this. But it also makes logical sense too. The more people that are in a group, the more people there are to provide defense or offense or both. There are more people there are to produce and secure resources. So farming, hunting, agriculture, what have you. The more people you have, the safer and more secure you are. Pulling from, if I may, Planet of the Apes, people apart are weak, people together strong.
Oh, I love that. Is that a quote from Dr. Zaius?
No, it's from Caesar.
Okay.
The ape Caesar.
I've only seen a couple of Planet of the Apes movies, but I always remember the Simpsons episode where they go to Planet of the Apes, the musical, and they have the song that's about Dr. Zaius, Dr. Zaius. Oh, Dr. Zaius. Dr. Zaius, Dr. Zaius.
Yeah, that was a very good one.
Anyway, there's a deep cut for everybody.
Yeah.
That's a very specific reference that I don't think anybody else would get. But I think I like that. I have a Simpsons tattoo that's a very specific reference. It's Lingo the Grammar Robot. So
nice.
Who knows whether there's anything to be learned from Calhoun's rats and Ratopia. Rats can be a good analog for humans in a lot of ways, and we've kind of seen that a lot in a lot of human experiments where we have started with studying rats and carried that over and those concepts and principles and things we've learned into human experimentation, but they do not have our propensity to engineer solutions to our problems. So it's hard to say. I mean, we know it's not the best analog. However, we can say that overcrowding will come with problems unprecedented by humans in the past because that's historically not been as much of an issue. Humans have adapted to scarcity. Humans have not really had to adapt to overcrowding to the extent that the rats did, but we seem to be trying to get there and trying to get there really, really hard. We are working at it. But, we won't really know how that if there's a one-to-one match on that until we get there. Or unless we specifically analyze microcosms that do exist where there are overcrowding right now.
Right. Yeah. I think that we do have areas where we can sort of look at overcrowding and how people are currently dealing with that. And I think that there are places where people are packed in about as close as the rats were, proportionally speaking, and we still seem to be doing okay.
I think you can look at the Kowloon Walled City, right? The Kowloon Walled City was still successful despite the fact that it was the most densely populated place on Earth.
That was that island where every square inch of it was covered by buildings and apartments and all that.
It might have been an island, but it was just this one, it was a city that was stacked on top of each other in this really small space where it was so densely packed that sunlight couldn't reach the street levels.
Yeah, I definitely heard about that, and that did not turn out well, because I believe that is a actual ghost town now. Not to say that there's ghosts.
That city is gone now, but for a period of time, it was okay.
Yeah.
Like, people made it work. Like, I think that's the thing. Like, those circumstances were really terrible, but for a period of time, people were making that work.
And this is not meant to be an episode on like family planning, if you will.
No.
But just to say that, like, I think we do need to consider the carrying capacity of the planet that we're on, and maybe make intentional decisions about how we use the space so that we all sort of make sense here, and that we're not filling spaces where we don't have room for people. Anyway, point being, it's difficult to say what exactly we would learn from those experiments because we haven't had the kind of overcrowding, but it does seem like for the most part we have engineered our way out of problems. And I think that, and we have taken on things as a species to navigate some of these major problems, even when we were at really large population levels. For instance, during some of these mass events of disease outbreak, and I think of the 1918 flu that killed off so many people, we started doing these mass vaccination programs. And back then, when we came out with vaccines, like, they were just administered. People just got them. And that helped stop and slow the spread of those diseases and saved a lot of lives. And now we've sort of said, no, you can keep killing people. That's okay. We'll try and convince people that they should get vaccinated. But for those of you who want to just kill people wantonly, you can make that choice instead. That is something I have a hard time understanding or wrapping my mind around. But it does seem to be what people are doing currently. Maybe, you know what? Maybe the anti-vaxxers are just trying to ensure that we don't ever reach overcrowding.
Yeah. Maybe.
They're the people on the street trying to make sure that we cull part of the population at regular intervals so that we don't have too many humans on the earth. That must be their agenda. I think that's what it is.
Yeah. Maybe they're looking out. Yeah.
Okay.
That's not true.
No. No, it's not.
I can't even be charitable about that.
No, it feels disingenuous.
Yeah.
I think the thing is, with the premise of this being, humans have depicted this chaotic, murderous, criminal inherentness to what humans will do when society breaks down. That's sort of what has been painted by these apocalyptic movies and books and TV shows, etc. And at this point, I think it's worth asking, is there a nugget of truth to this idea that that's how humans would behave in an end of days scenario?
Right. And so, there's always the question of fight or flight or freeze. That does come up a lot. And I think, there are always exceptions to the rule. There are always going to be people who decide to work alone, or they try to go and you'll see those kind of pockets of people that will disappear. But if there is any truth to the fear that people will turn on each other, that we will see the kind of every person for themselves type of chaos depicted in movies and TVs, it might be that we now have a set expectation for this. It's not necessarily that was always the case. It's that we have kind of created a narrative around that based on the entertainment that we consume. You almost have to kind of undo a little bit of that for people who maybe in a real situation have only ever watched some type of apocalypse movie or some type of apocalypse entertainment where they think that that's what's supposed to happen.
Right.
And the truth is it's very unlikely that would happen without that kind of narrative.
So yeah, we're now faced with the circumstance that many people, they've seen this depicted in art, in like TV show, movies, and books, etc., so often that if there was a catastrophic event that decimates the human population, we might actually expect to see at least some groups of survivors who expect other people to come and attack them.
Right.
And so they treat strangers with fear and skepticism that we see in those movies and TV shows. And it could be just because they believe that is how people would or should act in those events. And so they pull guns on each other. They steal each other's resources, and they go all sort of rogue bands of marauders, basically.
Yeah.
And not because that's what humans do in these events, but because that's what they've been led to believe humans do in these events, based on totally fictionalized scenarios. And I don't disparage those. I love disaster movies. I love end of world stories. I love zombies. I love the storytelling, and I love the creativeness of it. That's just not what humans have ever done.
Right.
And now I'm afraid that we've told, and I think for the sake of telling a story, it makes sense to have antagonists that are other people that are like, it makes sense to keep people engaged in the story by having them feel fear toward like, that could happen. Someone could do that to me. And so I think from a storytelling perspective, it makes total sense to leverage that idea, but that's just not what we've ever seen people do. But now people might think that is what people do.
Right. You see in kind of like more acute disasters, right? So like, I think there's probably a conversation about like these really acute events that happen versus like long-term survival needs. And I like to look at something like maybe like an earthquake in a city that causes a lot of disaster versus like the global pandemic and the differences in behavior across both of those, right?
Yeah.
So in an emergency, there's a difference between an emergency and an apocalypse, right? So like in an emergency when like an earthquake happens, people are going to scramble for a minute. Like there's a crisis, or like think about 9/11, right? Like something happens and there's a crisis and people are going to first scramble for safety most of the time to kind of make sure like, oh, okay, like let's like assess what's going on. And then they're going to immediately after dive in to try to help and try to figure out what to do. You saw that in 9/11. You saw that in the earthquakes in the Dominican Republic and all that. You saw this kind of, or in Haiti, and you see these kind of situations that occur where in the moment when the disaster is happening, people are going to scramble, but they are going to go right back in. You look at the pandemic and you look at, for the most part, people came together and they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to work from home. We're going to develop these systems to do this. We're all going to mask up. We're going to change some systems. We're going to update some systems. We're going to do some things right now just because this is the information that we have. So we're going to keep safe. And that was a movement of, global human behavior that changed based on some type of impending doom.
Yeah.
And I think that those examples, you see that like, whether it's acute or whether it's kind of like a slow burn disaster type of situation, in both the situations, you see that the majority of people went so far as to help one another, to look out for their fellow human, to really do the best to make sure that they were doing their part to protect other people. And I think that, whether those movies out there are going to inform that decision, I think for the most part, what we're still seeing is that people will jump into action in the right ways and really work to serve their fellow human.
Did we ever do, I feel like we did an episode that was sort of tangentially related to the Lord of the Flies, this idea of like people being stranded on an island. Do you remember us talking about that, or am I making that up?
I feel like I feel like you and I talk about all kinds of things all the time. So it's very possible that you and I talked about that, but we maybe never did an episode on it.
Okay. Well, so because there was this real life example of people who got stranded on an island, and it was like a bunch of kids. And while there, what they did is they worked together to form a little like society for themselves until they were rescued. They didn't devolve into this chaotic like winner takes all system on the island, which was the story of Lord of the Flies.
Well, the plane crash, the Chilean football team that crashed in Argentina, like that team that crashed, like they had to like survive for like 69 days on the mountaintop. Like they didn't break down and start murdering each other. Like even the Donner Party wasn't really doing that.
That's true. Yeah. We did an episode on that.
As grim as that situation was, they weren't really doing that. Like, so, even in those types of acute disasters, people aren't really doing those things.
Yes, exactly. And there's so many stories of this. There's acute disasters that were during expeditions, and like when things broke down, again, people still tried to help each other. I remember there was a story I was just hearing recently on a podcast talking about the first time people made their way to, I want to say it was the South Pole. And when you're down there, the environment is extremely harsh. And there was somebody there who was like in the crew who was really sick. And so the person who was in their group of people who felt the best gave up his portion of food to this person to help them pull through. And it's like, because it's so cold and they're like carrying equipment, they said that you easily are burning just through like 3,000-4,000 calories a day.
Right.
And so like you just have to eat a ton of food. And so like for this person to give up their food for this other person was a huge sacrifice,
right?
And that they're willing to do. And again, people do this. They sacrifice for each other. And as you've said, in these acute disasters, they sacrifice for each other. So like it worries me that I think there are people who prep as if they do expect that this is how people will behave in the event of of apocalypse. They're armed to the teeth and they're fully planned to isolate from people and be prepared to kill their neighbors. That's the thing I think that worries me about where there might be some truth to this. But most of the time, what we've seen people do is band together, and those people will be stronger for it.
Right.
And I think that's just the thing to know is if you choose to accept people into your group and to protect each other, you will be far stronger than trying to solo it with a bunch of guns.
Right. Exactly. 100%.
All right. Well, we did make it to one more ad break, and yeah, that's the thing that's happening. Sorry. All right, so we do have a couple of interesting tidbits, I think, things that are just kind of worth knowing or thinking about that I sort of came across in doing the preparation for this. And one of them was that there was an actual study that tried to calculate whether humans would survive a zombie apocalypse. And the answer, it turns out, is no.
No, not even close. The study created mathematical models to predict how long people would survive given the speed and communicability of a zombie virus. What they found was that, we'd be wiped out within a year. No one would survive, and that humans would be wiped out within a year because of a lot of different factors. But basically, if there's zombies, you're just not going to make it.
Yeah, it's just because they would grow to outnumber people, there would be impossible to essentially hold them back. That was sort of the general thing that they concluded with, is that it's just sheer numbers. They would outnumber people, and then they would really outnumber people, and then they would massively outnumber people. So if their motivation was in fact to spread this disease and kill and eat other people, they would be impossible to stop them because they would come in waves that you can't even imagine. What they did speak to, though, I think the authors of the study or someone else pointed out that they didn't really consider rates of childbirth and how people might be reproducing to stave off their own extinction. But the authors said they also didn't think it would matter much, as people would be killed off so quickly they wouldn't really have time to pad their population to prevent the total wholesale destruction of everyone.
Ugh.
But they did say that these are just sort of hypothetical models, but what they came up with is in these little simulations they created, everyone dies.
And to be fair, it sounds like this is a disease model and not necessarily a societal type of so there is a difference between looking at kind of the variables that go on with human behavior versus just communicable diseases. And just from a disease standpoint, yeah, we're not going to keep up.
That's a great point. Yeah. All right. The other one that I found was kind of interesting was this idea of apparently the CDC, the United States Center for Disease Control, has a protocol or a manual for how people behave in a crisis. They call it the psychology of a crisis and how to respond to a crisis when it emerges. And I found this updated as of 2019, which is going to be ironic as we unpack what they describe in here.
Yeah. So they discuss 4 ways of processing information. First, they say that you should simplify information, make it as simple as possible for people to understand so that it does not get misconstrued and it is not confusing for everybody who is involved in that crisis.
And actually, specifically, that is what they do recommend. And it is because people tend to simplify their own synthesis of information that they receive. So people basically, when they hear information, they sort of derive a quick takeaway from that. And so the simpler you can make your message, the more you can direct what people's takeaway is. Mm-hmm. But people tend to simplify information that they get. Another one is that people tend to hold on to their current beliefs. So people, whether they would have been flexible or not, become pretty rigid in what their thoughts are and beliefs are in crisis scenarios.
Does that sound familiar? Also, people will look for additional information and additional opinions because there is kind of a general and healthy distrust of scientists over the many years, or it's just the public, this type of information that goes out. People don't trust anybody. Nobody trusts anybody anymore. So when information goes out, they're always looking for additional information or opinions and additional opinions or information that might jive with their current beliefs. So you got that kind of working against you when you're disseminating anyway.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously going to be highly motivated to receive as much information as possible in a cataclysmic sort of event. They're trying to just learn what they can, so they're very susceptible to hearing anything. And what that means is that they'll often will believe whatever the first messages they receive might be.
Right.
So the speed of communication is really important. And so the CDC basically recommends as a not a counter, but like in preparation for this is how people react in these situations, that like how to try and best support people through this is to use simple messaging, to ensure that messaging comes from a credible source, to use consistent messaging, and to be accurate as soon as possible. And so they published this in 2019. And then we were faced with a global pandemic, and it seemed like everyone in charge at the CDC did not read their own book or manual on this, because we did not see consistent and clear communication from them.
Very confusing times, for sure.
I think they own that. I think they have said as much, that was a fault of theirs, but that is a thing that happened. And so it's worth just pointing out that is how they oriented to like how people behave in a crisis. And I think those are reasonable descriptions of what to expect in those situations. And it makes a lot of logical sense.
Yep, absolutely. 100%.
So I think just one thing I want to add before we wrap up here is talking about what we understand of psychology. And essentially, as we said, humans are very susceptible to social consequences and our social environment. We're very susceptible to cues from people around us for things that they like and things that they don't. And that is kind of part of why we were able to be cooperative in the first place, is because we are looking to one another for feedback and support and communication to help us do the things that we do. And so just thinking very logically about what we understand about behavior is that like we are going to do things that I think are both in line with what we already expect and believe, but we also find a lot of, it's a loaded term, but there's like inherent reward in helping each other.
Right.
You get people who do volunteer things all the time, and some of them do it because they feel compelled to do so for religious reasons, but plenty of people do it for totally altruistic reasons. Setting aside whether or not altruism is real, they do it because they feel it's the right thing to do for other people.
Right. Right.
That I think is really important to unpack, is that like we see this all the time in people's day to day when they don't have something that they have to fight against, that they try and like support others. And when we are faced with crises, most of the time, like the world comes to help, like we help each other. The powers that be come to help.
Yeah. And it's kind of a nice thought. If you're ever struggling with just kind of, I guess, that humanity is doomed, it's good to know that there's evidence that says otherwise, that people are just kind of primed to, like, from an evolutionary standpoint, not even from like a societal standpoint, just from like an evolutionary standpoint, we are primed to help each other. And that's a pretty nice feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think that's what we have to say about what people would do in the event of an apocalypse. It's something I've wanted to talk about for some time, because while I really enjoy all those stories, I have always felt like, I'm like, this isn't what people do. Like I have a hard time connecting to this all the way. Like I can totally get immersed in sort of the stories that carry the overall narrative thread of those. But I'm like, this isn't, people just don't behave this way in these scenarios. They never have. And there's really no evidence to suggest that they ever will, except for maybe those people who are expecting that to be the case. And so they sort of they manifest the problem they're afraid of.
Right.
But that even seems like that'll be a fairly small number of people. I think most people will do what people have always done, which is that we band together, we pool our resources, we defend each other. We have more people for defense, more people for producing resources, and we support each other. And the more people we have, the better able we are to do that sort of thing. So that's, I think, what I would expect from people in an apocalyptic event for real.
Yep. Agreed.
Okay. I think I've said the same message like 12 or 15 times now. So probably it's about time for us to instead just give credit where credit is due. If you like this and you'd like to support the show, you can join us on Patreon. And people who have already done that include this awesome group of people that we really appreciate. That is Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, Christy, and Michelle. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate you. Mm-hmm. If you join that group of people, we will read out your name as I have just done. You will also get behind the scenes and additional content, recordings of us talking before we actually hit record for the episode and after. as well as videos and notes and early access to episodes that are ad-free, all that kind of stuff. So consider that if you'd like to support what we're up to. You can also just leave us a rating and review, subscribe, share us with a friend or somebody. That's a great way to help support us non-financially, at least for you.
Yeah.
You can also pick up some merch. And I think that is all the things about support. Also, I need to thank my crew of people without whom I could not do this show. That includes writing and fact checking from Shane and myself, audio editing from Justin, and our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. I feel like I'm missing something. What am I missing? Am I missing anything?
I think we're just missing recommendations. Recommendations. So I have been spending a lot of time watching movies and shows that have to do with giant monsters fighting giant robots with my son. Nice. So like my son is obsessed with Godzilla, so we've been watching a lot of like kaiju related things. And so
beautiful. Yesterday
I introduced him to Pacific Rim. And so that is my recommendation because, man, what a brilliant movie. Like, so fun. Here's the thing. People get really funny about movies that don't require a lot of thinking.
Yeah.
This movie does not require a lot of thinking, but that's okay because you're talking about giant monsters fighting giant robots. And how could you not find joy in that?
Right.
I mean, like, seriously. And so if you're not familiar, this movie is written and directed by Guillermo del Toro, co-writer Travis Beacham, and it stars Charlie Hunnam, who plays some of the best character names ever in a movie. So Charlie Hunnam plays Raleigh Beckett. There's Rinko Kikuchi, who plays Mako Mori. You've got Charlie Day, who plays Dr. Newton Geisler, and Idris Elba, that plays a really like just kind of like no nonsense type of character named Stacker Pentecost. What great names, right?
Those are great names.
Ron Perlman is in this as like a weird. He plays Hannibal Chow, who's like a weird gangster, and the whole movie is about these giant monsters that come up out of the Pacific Rim from what they call the breach, and human beings have come together and pooled their resources to build these giant robots to fight these kaiju, since the kaiju are threatening the world. And it's kind of how the story evolves, and they have these what they call Jaegers to fight the kaiju, and it is just the coolest, man. It is just it's a beat 'em up, awesome robots versus monsters movie, and I don't know how people don't like it more.
I mean, movies are a visual medium, and I love all kinds of film. I really am a big fan of movies in general. But I mean, like, it's so good just watching. It's so satisfying just watching a robot and a giant like alien monster kaiju. They're just giant robots and monsters beating the living crap out of each other is just a delight. It's just so much fun.
It's so fun. Like you can't sit and watch this movie and watch one of the robots grab a giant oil tanker and just use it as a baseball bat and like fight this monster and go, nah, it's whatever. Exactly. Like, come on, y'all. Yeah. Like, grow up. Like, enjoy this stuff. Like, don't like,
grow up.
I think of like don't grow up. I think of what do they say in Step Brothers? Like, don't lose your dinosaur.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and go to my recommendation here. So that was Pacific Rim. That's available in lots of places. When did that come out? Was that like 2012 or something like that?
2013.
2013. Okay. So it's been out for a minute. There was a sequel. The sequel was not as good, but it was still fine if you're like into that sort of thing.
Sure.
We just want to see robots fighting aliens. That's all I wanted.
I watch that forever.
Yeah. So sequel's fine. The first one's really, really good. Anyway, that's Pacific Rim. I'm recommending another board game. I've been on a streak of recommending board games lately. I've had the wonderful opportunity to learn several. And so this board game is by Stonemaier Games. It's called Apiary. And I'm just going to read really quickly the summary of Apiary as it's described on the website because I think it's very funny. I mean, it's funny for a game nerd such as myself. It is a competitive worker placement hive building game about hyper-intelligent bees in space. So that is the one-liner about this.
I love that.
The thing about it, like, thematically, that's very silly and weird. And the art is really beautiful. It's really pretty how they did a great job. It's just like a really well-constructed game, too, in that, like, it really does a nice job setting up, like, here are the different things that you can do. And essentially what you're doing is you're exploring planets to spread the hive, the bees, And in doing so, you get resources which allow you to do more things. And that's just the game. So it's fairly straightforward in that sense, but it's got all these like really clever, unique little mechanisms that you don't see very often in other games. And so it's just a well done game. So if it's on the heavier side strategically. So if you're out looking for a simple game, I would not put this in the category of games that are like super easy, but I think it's really worth it. It's a game that's totally worth it to like learn the rules, learn the game, and then really get into it, because I think you could play it just over and over and over again and really enjoy it every time.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The art looks beautiful. It sounds like it's a lot of fun, and it sounds like it's really funny.
It's a pretty silly little game that I enjoy for that reason. Yeah, bees in space. Where could you go wrong?
How could you be mad about that?
So both of our recommendations were actually tangentially like end of the world, like end of humans type of thing. Because mine was,
I know, isn't that funny?
Yeah, my game, it takes place after humans are gone, and yours is that kaiju threaten to destroy the world. So
yep.
Anyway,
and they're very close.
That's the apocalypse. If you would like to email us and tell us, or just reach out to us at all and tell us something that we got wrong, something you agree with, or maybe something you disagree with, and give us some kind, constructive criticism, you can do that by reaching out to us directly at our email, info@wwd.podcast.com. You can also reach out to us on the social media platforms and chat with us there and give us your thoughts. We're happy to hear those in all those places. And thank you so much for listening. Is there anything that I forgot, or anything that you would like to add before we say goodbye, Shane?
Just be excellent to each other.
Yes, be excellent to each other. That is lovely. All right, great. Well, then that is a great note to end on. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
Be excellent to each other.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.